The story of Medusa. Medusa, a name that sends chills down the spine, a monster frozen in myth. But what if I told you she wasn't always a creature of terror? Her story didn't start with snakes or stone. She was once human, a woman whose beauty was so great that it caught the attention of gods and men alike. But what happens when beauty becomes a curse? A gift becomes a weapon? In this journey through Greek mythology, we explore how Medusa's beauty turned her into a monster, her fate sealed by the gods' vengeful desires. This is the tragic tale of Medusa, the woman who became a symbol of fear, a goddess cursed, and ultimately, a force of immense power. Let's dive into the origins of her transformation and discover how this mortal beauty became one of the most complex and powerful figures in mythology. What do you think? Was Medusa a victim of divine wrath, or did her beauty carry a curse from the start? Let's explore the beginnings of her tragic, monstrous legacy. Part 1. The origins of Medusa, a mortal beauty transformed. In the vast and intricate tapestry of Greek mythology, Medusa stands out as one of the most complex and tragic figures. But before she became the monster that would haunt the imaginations of mortals and immortals alike, she was a woman, albeit an extraordinary one. To understand the full scope of Medusa's tragic fate, we must first trace her origins, her early life, and the beauty that would both elevate her and doom her. Medusa's story begins in ancient Greece, within a time when gods and mortals often collided, and divine interventions could alter the course of a life in an instant. Medusa was born as the daughter of Phorcys and Ceto, two ancient primordial deities of the sea. Her lineage was far from ordinary. Phorcys and Ceto were deities of monstrous aspects, often depicted as the very forces of the sea's dark and treacherous nature. This made Medusa, from the very beginning, an unlikely candidate for the mortal realm's ideals of beauty. Her sisters, Stheno and Euryale, were born as immortals, creatures of legend with a grotesque appearance that would inspire terror in anyone who encountered them. However, Medusa was different. She was born immortal, distinct from her monstrous kin. As Medusa grew, she became known throughout the lands of Greece for her unparalleled beauty. She was immortal among gods and monsters, and her allure was irresistible. Her hair was said to be more radiant than gold itself, and her features were delicate and entrancing, a combination of charm and innocence that captivated anyone who gazed upon her. Her beauty was so profound that it drew the attention of those from both the mortal and divine realms. The tale of Medusa's transformation into a gorgon is intertwined with the myth of Poseidon, the mighty god of the sea. The most widely accepted version of the myth suggests that Poseidon, having witnessed Medusa's extraordinary beauty, became infatuated with her. The god of the sea, whose desires were as vast and uncontrollable as the ocean itself, was determined to possess her. Medusa, as the myth tells us, was a devoted servant of Athena, the virgin goddess of wisdom and warfare, and had sworn herself to a life of chastity and service. Yet, despite her vows, Poseidon's passion led him to pursue her relentlessly. In many versions of the myth, Medusa sought refuge in the sacred temple of Athena, hoping to escape Poseidon's advances. She believed that the temple, as a place of divine sanctity, would protect her, but Poseidon was undeterred, and within the very temple of Athena, he took what he desired. Some versions of the myth describe the act as one of force, while others paint it as a more complex interaction, rooted in Poseidon's overpowering will. Regardless, the consequences of this encounter would forever change the course of Medusa's life. Athena, enraged by the desecration of her temple, reacted with fury. However, in a twist of fate, her anger was not directed at Poseidon, the true perpetrator, but rather at Medusa herself. In ancient Greek mythology, the gods often acted in ways that were not necessarily just, and Athena's decision to curse Medusa rather than punish Poseidon was a profound moment in the mythological narrative. It was not an act of justice, but rather an act of vengeance, driven by the goddess's own sense of shame and pride. Athena blamed Medusa for the violation of her temple, seeing it as a defilement of her sacred space. As punishment, Athena transformed Medusa's most beautiful feature, her hair, into something unrecognizable. Medusa's radiant golden locks, which once glimmered like the sun, were turned into a mass of writhing snakes, each one venomous and capable of striking at a moment's notice. Her once entrancing face, full of youth and promise, became grotesque, twisted into a monstrous visage. Her eyes, which had once sparked with the potential of love and joy, now held an ominous power, the ability to turn anyone who gazed upon them into stone. This transformation was not just physical but symbolic. Medusa's beauty, which had once made her an object of desire, was now the source of her horror. The curse stripped Medusa of her identity as a woman and forced her into a monstrous form that inspired fear rather than admiration. No longer could she bask in the adoration of mortals, and no longer could she walk among the world of gods and men without spreading terror. She was now a being of death, cursed to live out her days in solitude, removed from the beauty and love she once embodied. However, it is important to note that, despite her punishment, Medusa's transformation is not without its complexities. In some versions of the myth, Medusa's change into a Gorgon is framed as a loss of innocence rather than a mere punishment. The beauty she possessed was, in many ways, a tool that led her to Poseidon's desires. She was a victim not only of Poseidon's lust, but also of Athena's wrath, a casualty in the struggle for control over divine spaces and sacred laws. Medusa, once a mortal woman, had become a creature of legend, feared and avoided by all. Her power to turn anyone to stone was both a reflection of her grief and rage at what had been done to her, and a symbol of her painful detachment from the world she had once been a part of. In the eyes of the gods, Medusa had become a monster, a warning of the consequences of defying sacred spaces and divine decrees. Medusa's curse marked the beginning of her descent into the abyss of isolation, but it also marked the start of her lasting legacy. She was not simply a creature of terror. She was a symbol of the intersection between beauty, power, and punishment in Greek mythology. Her image would go on to inspire countless stories, depictions, and interpretations in the centuries to follow, each one reflecting the complexity of her character. Medusa's story was no longer just a tale of a woman transformed into a monster. It was the story of a woman whose beauty, once a blessing, became both her downfall and her power. Part 2. Medusa's Curse, the Gorgon's Legacy. Medusa's transformation into a Gorgon is one of the most harrowing tales in Greek mythology, but it is only the beginning of her complex legacy. After Athena's curse, Medusa retreated from the mortal world, seeking solitude in the farthest reaches of the earth, far away from the realms of men and gods. It is here that the Gorgon, once a mortal woman, began to solidify her place in myth as a symbol of fear, isolation, and vengeance. Medusa's new form, though monstrous and terrifying, was not without its significance. Her transformation was not just a punishment. It was a manifestation of Athena's anger, but also a reflection of the dangers of the world she had once inhabited. Her hair, now a mass of living snakes, was a constant reminder of the wrath she had incurred. Each snake, according to some versions of the myth, had venomous fangs capable of rendering their victims into stone, thus ensuring that Medusa's gaze would not be the only source of death. It was the full embodiment of her curse, to never be free from the world of violence, fear, and death. Medusa's new life was one of exile. She was banished to the remote, desolate islands at the edge of the known world, isolated from the rest of humanity. Her presence, once desired, was now a terrifying threat. The curse Athena placed upon Medusa was not merely a physical change, but a complete erasure of the identity she had once held. As a woman, Medusa had been admired, desired, and cherished, but now she was a monster, feared by all who encountered her. The very thing that had once been her greatest gift, her beauty, was now the source of her eternal torment. Her ability to turn men to stone with a mere glance became a terrifying warning to anyone who dared venture too close. The mythological world's reaction to Medusa's curse was one of horror and avoidance. Her sisters, Stheno and Euryale, who had shared in her ancient heritage, remained as they had always been, immortal, terrifying, and filled with venom. But while they remained in their monstrous state, without the burden of Medusa's curse, Medusa became an outcast in every sense of the word. Her transformation into the Gorgon was complete. She was no longer a woman of the world of mortals or immortals. Instead, she was the embodiment of what it meant to be both the victim and the perpetrator of monstrous acts. It was a tragic irony that the beauty which had once made Medusa the object of desire now made her the object of horror. Medusa's new form and powers were terrifying, but they also provided her with a certain measure of strength and autonomy. The ability to turn anyone into stone was not just a curse, it was a defense mechanism, one that allowed Medusa to protect herself from the outside world. After all, she was no longer the beautiful woman who once walked freely among mortals. She was now a being that could not interact with the world without causing harm. The act of turning people into stone became, in some ways, a way for Medusa to preserve her existence while maintaining some level of control. The more people she turned to stone, the fewer people there were to confront her, and in that sense, she found some semblance of safety. Despite her isolation, Medusa's story did not end in the wilderness. In fact, it was during this time of solitude that she became the subject of one of the most well-known and defining moments in her myth, the arrival of Perseus, the hero who would ultimately end her life. While Medusa may have been isolated from the world, the gods of Olympus were never far from her story. In fact, it was their whims that would determine Medusa's fate. Perseus, the son of Zeus and Danae, was tasked with retrieving the head of Medusa as part of a nearly impossible quest. For Perseus, the slaying of Medusa was no mere accident of fate. It was a divine command, one issued by King Polydectes of Seriphos. Polydectes, seeking to rid himself of the young hero, sent Perseus on an impossible mission, one that would ultimately lead him to Medusa's lair. Before Perseus could embark on his dangerous quest, however, he was aided by a number of gods who saw potential in him. Athena, who had played such a pivotal role in Medusa's transformation, offered Perseus guidance, while Hermes, the messenger god, provided him with the tools necessary to succeed. Perseus was given a bronze shield, a sword, and a pair of winged sandals. The most important gift, however, was the helmet of invisibility that would allow him to approach Medusa's lair unseen. With these divine gifts, Perseus set off to confront the Gorgon. The method by which Perseus would defeat Medusa was as clever as it was brutal. Armed with Athena's polished shield, Perseus would not look directly at Medusa, knowing that her gaze would turn him to stone. Instead, he used the reflection in the shield to guide his sword and avoid her deadly stare. Approaching her while she slept, Perseus beheaded Medusa in a moment of eerie silence. The head, which retained its terrifying power even after death, was placed in a bag and carried with him as he fled. The death of Medusa marked the tragic end of a life filled with beauty, punishment, and isolation. It also marked the beginning of Medusa's legacy, as her head would become one of the most powerful symbols in Greek mythology. The severed head, still capable of turning its victims to stone, would become a symbol of power and terror, used by heroes and gods alike to strike fear into their enemies. But even in death, Medusa's story did not end. The legacy of Medusa lived on long after her death, both as a symbol of fear and a symbol of tragic victimhood. Medusa's head would later be placed on the shield of Athena, becoming a central part of the goddess's protective aegis, further cementing Medusa's role as an enduring figure in Greek mythology. Her myth would continue to be told, retold, and reinterpreted for generations to come, serving as both a cautionary tale and a tragic narrative of divine cruelty. Part 3. The aftermath of Medusa's death, her legacy and transformation. The death of Medusa did not mark the end of her influence on the world. In many ways, it was only the beginning of a much larger legacy. The consequences of her death were felt far beyond the momentary loss of the Gorgon herself. Medusa's head, severed by Perseus, took on a life of its own, becoming a symbol of power, fear, and divine intervention that would echo throughout Greek mythology. Her death, tragic as it was, turned her from a living monster into one of the most enduring and iconic figures of the ancient world. After Perseus had slain Medusa, he did not simply abandon her remains. Her head, which still held immense power even in death, was carefully placed in a bag by the hero, who would later use it to defend himself in various encounters. The severed head had the ability to turn anyone who gazed upon it into stone, a power that remained intact even after Medusa's demise. It was this very head that would become one of the most coveted and feared objects in Greek mythology. The most notable use of Medusa's head occurred during Perseus's return journey. Along the way, he encountered the Titan Atlas, who had once tried to block Perseus's path. Atlas was transformed into stone when he looked upon Medusa's head, solidifying the Gorgon's power even in death. This act of petrification was a perfect example of the continued potency of Medusa's gaze, and it highlighted just how deeply her legacy was embedded in the world's mythology. The head was also used by Athena, who, after Perseus's journey, took the head from him and placed it on her aegis, a shield that became a symbol of divine protection. The head of Medusa, with its frightening gaze, served as a powerful talisman for Athena, who used it as a means of warding off enemies. It is said that her aegis was used in battle to strike fear into the hearts of foes, rendering them paralyzed by the sheer terror of the Gorgon's face. Athena's use of Medusa's head emphasized the transformation of Medusa from a victim of divine punishment into a symbol of terror and protection. Her image, once feared as a curse, was now a divine weapon in the arsenal of one of the most powerful deities of the Greek pantheon. Medusa's head did not only serve Athena, it was also featured on the coins of the ancient Greek city of Aegina as a symbol of protection, prosperity, and fear. The Gorgon's face became an icon so powerful that it transcended her original story. No longer was Medusa seen solely as a tragic victim or a monster, but as an emblem of divine authority and the intersection of beauty and horror. As time passed, Medusa's myth was retold in many variations and her image evolved. While the ancient Greeks primarily saw her as a terrifying figure, some later interpretations began to emphasize her victimhood. She was no longer just a monster, but a tragic figure whose beauty and transformation into a Gorgon were caused by the wrath of the gods. Some saw her as a symbol of divine cruelty, and in some feminist readings of the myth, Medusa is reimagined as a victim of patriarchal control, her curse being a manifestation of male anger at female power and independence. This interpretation offered a more sympathetic view of Medusa, portraying her as a tragic heroine whose beauty and sexuality were punished by the gods in a harsh, unjust manner. The evolution of Medusa's myth also reflected the broader cultural shifts in Greek society, particularly regarding the role of women. In some later artistic representations, Medusa became a symbol of female empowerment, a woman who, despite being cursed, wielded an incredible power over life and death. Her image would later inspire numerous works of art, from ancient pottery to Renaissance paintings, and even in modern-day literature and film. But despite these shifts in interpretation, Medusa remained a symbol of both beauty and terror, of divine punishment and protection. Her legacy was forever entwined with the gods who had punished her, and her story became a cautionary tale about the consequences of divine wrath and the price of beauty. Part 4. Medusa's impact on Greek mythology and the wider world. Medusa's impact on Greek mythology went far beyond her own story, influencing the culture, religion, and artistic traditions of the ancient world. The Gorgon's myth became a central part of Greek mythological storytelling, and her image permeated not just the religious practices of ancient Greece, but also the visual culture of the time. Her story is often referenced in the heroic tales of Greek mythology, from the deeds of Perseus to the foundational myths of the Argonauts and Heracles. Medusa's myth is an essential part of the Greek understanding of heroism, divine power, and the nature of punishment. The Gorgon serves as a warning to those who defy the gods, a reminder of the god's capacity for both wrath and mercy, and a symbol of how beauty and power can be intertwined with destruction. In a sense, Medusa's myth is a microcosm of the larger Greek understanding of fate and divine will. Mortals and gods alike must navigate a world in which beauty, power, and punishment can exist in a fragile balance. Her role in art, particularly on Greek pottery, is significant. The Gorgon's face was often used as a decorative element, most notably as a protective motif. The face of Medusa was frequently used on the pediments of temples, and as part of the imagery on amphorae, large ceramic vessels used for storing wine, oil, and grain. Medusa's face was thought to ward off evil, much as the gaze of the living Gorgon had done in her lifetime. This symbolism continued into Roman times, where Medusa's image was used in the decoration of buildings and even coins, further solidifying her status as a figure of power. Medusa's legacy also extended into literature. She became a subject of poetry and storytelling, and writers have long used her image to convey themes of beauty, monstrosity, and the clash of power between mortals and gods. Her myth is cited in various works, from ancient tragedies to modern literature, with authors often using her as a symbol of the destructive power of jealousy, rage, and revenge. One of the most enduring interpretations of Medusa's myth is as a representation of the power of the feminine, a potent reminder of how women's beauty and strength have historically been met with fear, punishment, and repression. In modern times, Medusa's legacy has been reinterpreted in literature, film, and feminist thought. Many contemporary depictions of Medusa have reimagined her as a tragic figure who was wronged by the gods and punished for being a victim of male desire. These interpretations challenge the ancient myths, which often painted Medusa as a monster deserving of her punishment. Today, Medusa is frequently depicted as a symbol of empowerment, with her monstrous appearance now seen as an external manifestation of the oppression she faced as a woman. Medusa's myth, from its origins as a simple tale of divine wrath to its evolution into a symbol of feminist empowerment, shows how myths can be reinterpreted over time. Her story remains relevant not just as part of ancient Greek myth, but also as a lens through which we examine power, gender, and the complexities of beauty. Through Medusa, we are reminded that mythology is never static. It evolves, it adapts, and it continues to speak to the people who encounter it, regardless of the era. Her myth is timeless, not just as a tale of punishment and tragedy, but as a story that reflects the enduring struggles of the human condition. What do you think about Medusa's story? Was she treated unfairly, or do you think she had power? Let us know your thoughts in the comments.